Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for this week's movie mystery. My schedule is a little out of whack at the moment because I do be having a breakdown 99% of the time, but we move. It's still October, so I'm still serving you some costume realness. Can you tell what it is? Oh, sorry, I'm just getting a phone call. Hang on. Hello?
Do you know what time it is?
A watch doesn't really go with this outfit, Daddy.
Where are you?
Just having a snack with some girlfriends.
Where, in Kuwait?
Is that in the valley?
I'm
It's
sure,
sure, bitch. I didn't want to do some gruesome, nasty costume this week, just because if I'm not going to a Halloween party this year, then I'm not purchasing fake blood. And also, today's case is about the murder of an innocent woman. And I don't know, I just think it might come across as a little bit disrespectful if I sit here covered in fake blood talking about some innocent woman. Maybe. Today we're going to be talking about what is hopefully going to become a new series on my channel, Celebrities Who Kill, and in particular, Phil Spector. Let's just jump straight into it. So, Phil Spector was born on December 26th, 1939. He is most well known for being a music mogul that made some revolutionary changes that have changed the music scene forever. His childhood was somewhat rocky. He was born in the Bronx to a Benjamin and a Bertha Spector. When he was about 10 years old, his father committed suicide, and so the family moved to Los Angeles. Apparently, his family weren't really very close-knit. There wasn't a lot of hugging or love in the family, but that's according to Spector. In 1958, Spector and some friends formed a pop group called the Teddy Bears and released their first single, To Know Him Is to Love Him, which was a smash hit. The song was written by Spector, and the title was actually taken from the words on his father's headstone. The group didn't really last very long though. Spector wasn't interested in being the face of a musical group. He was more interested in what was behind the face, as in the music production. And so he became a music producer, and a very successful one at that. He worked with acts like the Ronettes, Ike and Tina Turner, Leonard Cohen, and the Ramones. And in 1969, he even produced what is probably one of the most famous albums ever made, Let It Be by the Beatles. The reason Spector was so successful was because of his new musical formula called the Wall of Sound. From what I understand, this technique was essentially like an orchestra. There would be multiple different instruments all playing the same notes, all layered on top of the other. This would make no instrument distinguishable from the other. They would also use a lot of reverb to make it kind of echoey. Previously in music, the instruments would be very separate and distinguishable. It would be like one section of a violin playing and then one section of a trumpet playing. But this new wall of sound technique was layering all of these sounds on top of each other. Songs like Good Vibrations and Wouldn't It Be Nice by the Beach Boys are good examples of this technique. Spector was also known for being very controlling of the whole production process. He was really free to do whatever he wanted with it. He also became known as the first musical auteur. However, he was also described as being a little odd or eccentric. His rapid success at such a young age meant that he had a huge ego. He thought he was hot shit and could do no wrong, and no one could tell him that he'd done wrong if he did. This was to the point where if he didn't get his way, he would have huge temper tantrums and scream at people. He was also frequently seen waving guns around and pointing them at people. One time he was in a meeting with John Lennon and he obviously got pissed off about something because he said, "Well, you can't tell me what to do," pulled out a gun and shot at the ceiling. That wouldn't be the last time a gun was fired around John Lennon. Nedra Ross, who was one of the lead singers of the Ronettes, also described Spector as being very odd. She talked about one incident where they had all gone to London together, and for some reason, Spector decided that the whole time they were there, he was going to use a completely different voice. And it was a really high-pitched, nasally voice as well, so it was really embarrassing for them.
1, 2, 3.
She also said that he would always carry a gun with him and that people would pick on him quite often since he was a very small man and he didn't look like much of a threat, and when they did, Spector would always pull a gun out on them. In 1968, Spector married Ronnie Bennett of the Ronettes. The two had become very close whilst they were working together. The marriage was awful and very abusive. In 1969, they adopted a son called Dante. Then, 2 years later, Phil brought home two 5.5-year-old twin boys as a Christmas present for his wife. Children! For a Christmas present! Ronnie and Phil separated in 1974, but Ronnie was always very quiet about what actually went on in the home. All the media really knew was that once Ronnie and Spector were married, Ronnie completely disappeared from the music scene. She stopped performing live, and she even stopped making new music. This was especially odd because this was at the peak of her career. In 1990, Ronnie released her memoir, Be My Baby, How I Survived Mascara, Miniskirts and Madness. The memoir detailed some of the abuse she suffered at Spector's hands. She described how she was completely forbidden from ever leaving the house. She would be locked in if she was left home alone, the house was surrounded with barbed wire and guard dogs, and Spector even went so far as confiscating all of her shoes so that she couldn't leave. She said that in the 7 years she was married, she left the house maybe 5 times in total. The few times she was ever allowed to leave the house, she had to drive with a life-size dummy of Spector in the passenger seat. She said that Spector frequently pulled a gun on her and threatened to kill her. He even bought a gold coffin with a glass top, which he displayed in the basement, and he used to tell her that if she ever tried to leave him, he would kill her and display her in that coffin, because I can keep my eye on you after you're dead. Ronnie only managed to get away from him with the help of her mother. In 1972, she escaped barefoot with her son Dante in her arms. In 1974, when their divorce was finalised, Ronnie forfeited all future record earnings because Spector had threatened to hire a hitman to kill her. Surprisingly, it doesn't really seem that anyone at the time really questioned Ronnie's sudden absence from the music scene, or from the outside world in general. Probably because by 1970, Spector had become more and more reclusive. He'd never really had many friends, but at this point he'd started to completely separate himself from the outside world. Some people suspect that what made this reclusiveness worse was that in 1974, Spector was in a really bad car crash in Hollywood. He was thrown through the windshield of his own car. He suffered serious head injuries and required 300 stitches to the face and more than 400 to the back of his head. If you've ever seen a photo of Phil Spector, he's always got some crazy manic hair and it just never looks good. It's because they're wigs, and some people speculate that the reason that he started wearing these wigs was to cover the scarring that he received from this accident. Anyway, this whole head injury story is relevant to the rest of this story, so don't worry. It's time to introduce another key person to this story, Miss Lana Clarkson. Lana Clarkson was born on April 5th, 1962 in Long Beach, California. She was an actress and a model. Her screen debut was in 1982 in Amy Heckling's Fast Times at Ridgemont High, though this was a very small role. This seemed to be a very common thread for Lana. Though she appeared in a lot of films and a lot of TV shows, she was never really able to secure a main character role. That was until she appeared in Barbarian Queen in 1985. The film was your kind of typical female warrior movie, and Lana played the lead role of Queen Amalthea. She was perfectly suited to this role, as Lana was a beautiful blonde goddess of a woman at nearly 6 feet tall, and she could do all her own stunts. Though the film wasn't incredibly successful, it did gain a bit of a cult following, and it obviously secured enough money for a sequel, as Barbarian Queen 2, The Empress Strikes Back was released in 1992. This, however, was a direct-to-video release, and unfortunately marked the peak of Lana's career. Though she did fit Hollywood's conventional standards of beauty, and she was a great actress, Lana really struggled to find work. It was her dream to work in the entertainment industry. She loved the work and she loved her fans, even setting up a website where fans of her Barbarian Queen character could buy signed copies of the video. In January 2003, however, with the acting jobs almost completely dried up, Lana resorted to taking a job as a hostess at the House of Blues nightclub to make ends meet. It's not like this was some dead-end, I'm giving up my dreams hosting job though, don't get me wrong. The House of Blues was a very elite club frequented by some very elite and powerful people, and Lana really saw this job as an opportunity to connect with powerful people who, if they liked her enough, may be able to secure her acting jobs again. Especially since Lana was in charge of the most exclusive bit of the club, the foundation room. She was in charge of lifting the velvet rope and looking after the most top and exclusive celebrities. But Lana had only worked there for a couple of weeks when disaster struck. On February 2nd, 2003, Phil Spector went out to dinner with an old high school friend to the Grill on the Alley, an upscale Beverly Hills restaurant. She reported that Spector was drinking a lot that night, and it really affected his demeanour. He wasn't exactly jovial, shall we say. This was so much so that she actually asked Spector if she could go home, and Spector had his chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, take her home. The night wasn't over for Spector yet, however. He then picked up another woman, Kathy Sullivan, and took her out to Trader Vic's and then to Dan Tanner's restaurant. Weirdly enough, this woman later said that she didn't believe that Spector was drunk at all when he picked her up, and though they were drinking together all night, he was very upbeat and positive all night. At around 1:30 a.m, the two headed over to the House of Blues. They went up to the foundation room where Lana Clarkson was manning the door. Lana initially refused them entry, although I'm not exactly sure why. The club closed at around 2 a.m, so it could possibly be that they were just there too late to be let in, but perhaps it could just be that Spector didn't have an exclusive VIP badge or something, so Lana didn't recognise him to know to let him in. That night, Spector was wearing one of his usual extravagant, disgusting wigs, this time a long curly one. Because of the fact that the club was quite dark, coupled with the fact that Spector was wearing a long curly wig and was very short, Lana accidentally referred to him as Miss. Spector was reportedly outraged by this and used the classic line of, "Do you know who I am?" To which Lana responded, "No, I don't know who you are and you can't come in." She was then pulled aside by another co-worker who informed her that this was Phil Spector, an incredibly wealthy and important music mogul. Lana quickly apologised and let him in, probably very embarrassed and worried that she had made a mistake that could affect her entire career. When they sat down at the table, Spector ordered a shot of rum straight up, but his companion, Kathy Sullivan, had had enough of drinking for the night and ordered a water. Spector was reportedly enraged by this and told her to order an effing drink, but she still refused and she ended up with her water. Shortly after this, Kathy Sullivan decided that she had really had enough, and Spector got his driver to take her home whilst he stayed at the House of Blues. It seemed that Spector had completely forgotten about Lana's misgendering mistake, as he asked her to have a drink with him. Lana wasn't allowed to drink on the job, although she did go and ask her boss if it was okay to make an exception this time, presumably because she felt she owed it to him for her mistake, but her boss refused and so did she. Spector wasn't going to give up that quickly though. He apparently hated being alone in public and felt that having somebody with him all the time made him look more important. Lana clocked out at 2:21 a.m. When she began walking to her car, Phil Spector was still hanging around outside. She helped him over to his limousine since he was stumbling a bit, not surprising considering how much he would have drank that night, and Spector invited her to join him for a drink at his home, a massive mansion called the Pyrenees Castle. According to the chauffeur's testimony, Lana had refused this offer, but Spector would not give in. He kept asking and asking, practically begging her. Lana eventually gave in, but only on the promise that it would be just one drink. On their way back to the castle, the two sat in the back of the vehicle watching the old Hollywood movie Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, an ominous sign of what was about to come. They arrived at the castle around 3 a.m. What exactly happened inside the castle is a little bit of a mystery. Adriano de Souza, the driver, said he stayed in the vehicle parked outside the front of the house as he didn't think that he was going to be there for very long, as Lana herself had said that she only wanted to stay for one drink, so he figured he was going to be driving her home pretty soon. Shortly before 5 a.m, however, Adriano was still sitting out there. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise, what was later discovered to have been a gunshot. He got out of the car and Spector emerged from the home carrying a gun in his hand. He said to Adriano, "I think I've killed somebody." Adriano quickly called 911, although not before calling Spector's personal assistant Michelle Blaine. Although, as it was 5 a.m, she didn't answer this call because personal assistants do not work 24 hours, no matter how much their employers would like them to. The following 911 call was a very important piece of evidence in the trial that was to follow.
911, what are you reporting?
Hi, my name is Adriano. I think my boss killed somebody. Please, can you send me
You think your boss killed somebody?
Yes, yeah. Because I'm a driver, I'm waiting outside and I don't know what.
And why do you believe he may have killed somebody?
Because you have a lady on the floor and he has a gun in his hand.
Around 5 a.m, the police arrived at the home. As they believed there was a potential armed shooter in the building, the paramedics were not allowed on site until about an hour after the police arrived, which is a crucial amount of time when we're talking about life and death. To the police's surprise, however, Spector came out of the house willingly and invited the police into the house, saying something along the lines of, "You won't believe what you're about to see." Obviously, since they had had a report that there was an armed shooter, the police told Spector to put his hands up, which he did, but because he was so drunk, he kept forgetting that he needed to keep them up and kept putting his hands back in his pockets. Obviously, for the police, this is very suspicious behaviour because he could have anything in those pockets, and so they ended up tasering him to try and take him into custody. They fired a taser at him twice, but it misfired both times. They were eventually able to take him into custody at the Alhambra Police Department. What the police found in the house was a shocking and confusing scene. Lana Clarkson's body was slumped into a chair in the foyer. Her jacket was on and her handbag was over her shoulder, and the weapon, a Colt revolver, was lying beneath her left ankle, along with a couple of her teeth scattered about the floor. There were liquor bottles and some lit candles on the table, and some romantic soft music playing. There were no clear signs of a struggle, no smashed glass or broken ornaments. In fact, there was only one drawer in the entire house that had been opened, the one in which Spector kept his revolver. The revolver which was now lying at Lana's feet. The police knew this, by the way, since the holster for the gun was still in the drawer. When the paramedics were eventually allowed into the building around 6 a.m, they were basically just there to determine death. Police were pretty certain when they arrived that Lana was already dead, and that's why they didn't mind waiting so long to get the paramedics into the building. The paramedic who took the stand confirmed that Lana was definitely dead, but oddly enough, he couldn't actually find a gunshot wound. He was asked during the trial if he noticed anything odd about her body. He said it did cross his mind that it looked as though her body had been moved, although he wasn't certain. The reason for this is because Lana was slumped with her head on, I believe it was her left side, and yet all the body was on the right side of her face. You would think with gravity, if she had been shot and her head had fallen to the left, that all the blood would have rushed down onto the left side of her face and onto the floor, but this wasn't the case. All the blood was on the opposite side of the face. He also noticed that there were smears of blood on her cheeks and on the bridge of her nose, which weren't caused by him because he had been checking her pulse, but he had only ever touched her jawline to move her head ever so slightly, meaning that these blood swipes could have come from somebody repositioning her body. Police also found smears of blood on a door handle, on the banister of the stairs, and a bloody towel in the bathroom. They also found about 9 guns in the house, all of which were kept loaded. The presence of blood in other rooms in the house did seem a little weird, especially considering Spector's story. When Spector was questioned at the Alhambra police station, officers noted that he reeked of alcohol and he seemed to be very intoxicated. His version of events, as well as the way he was relaying them, was very odd. He claimed that he had met Lana in the House of Blues and invited her back to his house for a drink, that they didn't know each other at all, and that all of a sudden she had picked up one of his guns and shot herself in the temple. Which is a little weird because there was no bullet wound in her temple. He continued to rant and rave, absolving himself of any responsibility and calling Lana some really horrible names. He felt like he was the real victim here, of some crazy woman who had come into his house and decided to kill herself in front of him.
Absolute nonsense. He was a piece of and I don't know what the problem was. If you certainly have no right to come to my dad, so blow her head open and think of murder. What the is wrong with you people?
Once he began sobering up, however, Spector realised it was about time he get himself a lawyer. And what a lawyer he got. Spector hired Robert Shapiro, a man best known for being on the dream team of lawyers who managed to defend O.J. Simpson in his murder trial in 1995. For context, by the way, Shapiro was played by John Travolta in American Crime Story. The O.J. Simpson trial may be the next one in this little series, I think. We all know that O.J. Simpson was guilty, let's be honest here. Shapiro, a very successful lawyer, was able to get Spector released on a $1 million bond. Chump change for a man like Spector. Spector and his personal assistant Michelle Blaine then holed themselves up at the illustrious Bel Air Hotel for about 7 or 8 days while his house was being searched by police. Michelle later said that while they were there, she tried to get the real story out of him, and all Spector kept saying was, "It was an accident." Shapiro quickly set up a wall of publicity around Spector, basically meaning that they could spin whatever story they wanted to the media before the police got the chance to do a press conference. The defence's version of events was that Lana's death was an accidental suicide by a depressed and deranged woman who saw a gun in Spector's home and took that as an opportunity, leaving Spector as an innocent witness. An autopsy by the LA County coroner, Dr. Pena, showed that Lana had died instantly when the gun was discharged in her mouth. not in her temple as Spector had told police. Her blood alcohol level was 0.12, which is over the legal limit for driving, but I don't think that necessarily means that she was smashed, and she also had Vicodin in her system. It was later read in court that she was taking this Vicodin as a pain medication for some severe headaches she was experiencing, but the defence used this in court to argue that her mixing this Vicodin with the alcohol was what caused her to decide to end her own life. On December 22nd, 2003, the coroner pronounced the death as a homicide. This was odd since the actual DNA evidence was on Spector's side. Spector's fingerprints weren't found on the gun, but neither were Lana's, which you would expect if she had committed suicide. It seemed like the gun had been wiped clean. This makes sense since Adriano said that Spector came out of the house with the gun in his hand, but when the police arrived, the gun was under Lana's left ankle. As well as this, tests were done for gunshot residue on both Lana's and Spector's hands. There was extensive gunshot residue on Lana's hands, but only 2 tiny particles on Spector's. This would suggest that Lana's hands were on the gun when it was fired, but this doesn't necessarily mean that she was the one that fired it. The white jacket that Spector had been wearing that night was found hung up in his wardrobe. There were no visible signs of blood on it, although on further examination, tiny marks were found by forensic testing. A blood spatter expert testified that the location of the blood put Spector around 2 or 3 feet from Lana when the gun was fired, a strangely close distance if he wasn't the one that fired it. On November 20th, 2003, Spector is officially charged with murder. He pled not guilty, and so the case went to trial. The judge presiding over the trial, Judge Fiddler, allowed for the trial to be televised. I've always found that a bit weird. Why do they allow for that? I can only imagine it's to make an example of Spector, since he was a famous person, and famous people always seem to get away with stuff scot-free when they do anything illegal. But at the same time, surely the publicity is really bad. Like, think about how much the public's opinion in the OJ case affected the results of the outcome. By this point, Spector had fired Robert Shapiro and began working with another lawyer, Leslie Abramson. This didn't last very long either, as they had a terrible working relationship. Their personalities clashed really badly. Spector was a big personality, and as I said, he liked to get his way. So when Leslie would show up at press conferences to defend him, he would constantly interrupt her and tell his own version of the story, which would sometimes contradict hers.
This man was tasered in his own home, thrown to the ground at the foot of the poor deceased Miss Clarkson.
Broken nose and 2 black eyes and 50,000 volts of electricity shot through me, unarmed, invited the police into my house.
The whole point of hiring a lawyer is so that you don't have to say anything that could possibly get you in any more trouble and get your story confused. Leslie had to keep turning around and telling him to be quiet, because if he said the wrong thing, it could really affect the outcome of the case, and also her career, since defense lawyers want to successfully defend somebody. They ended up parting ways. That really reminds me, going off track for a second, but that really reminds me of Ted Bundy. If you know anything about Bundy, you know that he loved to defend himself in court. He loved the sound of his own voice. And I feel like Spector has that same kind of arrogance where he can't deal with somebody speaking for him, even if he knows that it's the sensible and right decision to do that. On March 22nd, 2005, Spector asked his assistant, Michelle Blaine, to set up a website and film a video of him that he could post on there. The video was essentially him telling his own version of events without a lawyer present, because he thought that the public would be able to understand him and forgive him more if he spoke out himself, I guess. Anyway, the video is a mess. He's just ranting and saying all this horrible stuff about Lana Clarkson. He keeps shouting about how he doesn't have a motive to kill her, and the most important thing in a crime is the motive, and how he doesn't even care why Lana Clarkson would kill herself.
To those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Phil Spector. In every famous crime trial, what is the most important thing that one has to have in order to be found guilty of any crime? That is M-O-T-I-V-E, motive. Now, what her motive was for taking her own life, I don't know, and I really don't care.
He comes across very badly, and Michelle eventually decided not to post the video online because of that. Although you can still find it, little clips of it, some places online. Michelle ended up leaving Spector in September 2005 as she had begun to question all the different conflicting stories that he had told her, and started to believe that he was not innocent. Spector was very fearful about her going on the stand or telling the public all of these things that he told her in confidence, whatever they may be. She later said that when she tried to leave him, he was fuming and was screaming at her that she was only allowed to leave when she was fired. She left anyway and said that as she was walking down the stairs, she heard him say, "I should have killed you." The trial began on March 19th, 2007. The prosecution was led by Pat Dixon and Alan Jackson. Spector at this point had hired a new attorney, Bruce Cutler, a New York lawyer known for successfully defending mafia boss John Gotti 3 separate times. Yet again though, his relationship with this lawyer was not great. You see, Cutler was used to working in New York and it was a very different style of defending there than it was in LA. Cutler was very loud, brash and accusatory, which was not only the complete wrong style for LA, but also for a trial that involved topics like domestic violence. The judge was heard to reprimand him during the trial, which made him look especially bad because that seriously undermined him in front of the jury. The state's case was that Spector had invited Lana back to his house and had become enraged when she had tried to leave without having sexual intercourse with him. He had become so enraged that he had pulled a gun on her, forcing it into her mouth so hard that it had knocked her front teeth out. She put her hands on the gun to try and push it away from her, but in his anger, Spector fired the gun and killed her. The defence's argument was that Lana had been deeply troubled and was suffering from depression since she was stuck working in a nightclub when she wanted to be a Hollywood actress. They claimed that she had mixed her medication with alcohol and when she saw the gun in Spector's home, took the opportunity and committed suicide, leaving Spector as an innocent witness. This is a pretty obvious defense since Lana wasn't there to testify for her own mental health, obviously, and it's pretty easy to paint anybody as having difficult times or something in their life that would warrant them wanting to commit suicide if you look hard enough for it. A great point that I had to mention was that in a pre-trial hearing, the prosecution won the right to introduce statements made by Spector following his arrest, but when it came to the trial, they chose not to use these statements. This completely messed with the defense since they presumed that this was going to be a pivotal part of the prosecution's argument and had written their entire opening statement based around these statements. Obviously, they couldn't then use this opening statement after the prosecution had not mentioned anything because it would make Spector look so guilty, and so Bruce Cutler had to improvise his entire opening statement there on the spot. This did not make him look good as it was the first thing he said in the entire trial and he was completely stumbling over his words and was clueless basically. They ended up having to ask for a recess until the next day so they could rewrite their entire statement. Brilliant play by the prosecution there, you love to see it. The only other thing that I haven't mentioned that was brought up in the trial was that the prosecution had 5 different women take the stand to testify that they had been involved in some kind of relationship with Spector and that he had at some point pulled a gun on them. They all told a very similar story, that Spector had been drinking, they had spurned his advances, and Spector had pulled a gun on them to try and stop them from leaving. This was a great piece of evidence since it proved that Spector was willing to pull a gun on women, and the scenarios seemed to match up entirely with what happened to Lana, other than the fact that these women had survived. The defense's counter-argument for this was a bit odd, although I guess it would be pretty difficult to refute these witnesses' statements. They claimed that, yes, Spector has pulled a gun on plenty of people plenty of other times before, but this doesn't necessarily mean that he would ever fire it. In fact, the fact that all those women were alive to testify proved that Spector would never fire that gun. It's kind of a stupid argument though, because if you're drunkenly waving a gun around enough times, then eventually at some point somebody is going to get shot. After 4 months of testimony, the jury went to deliberate. On an initial head count, 4 members of the jury believed he was guilty, 5 were not guilty, and 3 were undecided. Although it seems that most of these not guilties were just because they couldn't decide if there was enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Spector had definitely 100% killed her. After 12 days, the jury reported back that they could not come to a decision. It was 10-2 to convict, but unfortunately you cannot convict somebody unless there is a unanimous decision. On September 26, 2007, Judge Fiddler declared a mistrial. The prosecution were very eager to convict Spector, and so a second trial was arranged, which began on October 20th, 2008. Spector was now represented by Doran Weinberg, and the lead prosecutor remained as Alan Jackson. Very few changes were made to the prosecution's case, but they did have Lana Clarkson's mother take the stand. She testified that the day of Lana's death, her and Lana had gone shopping together, and Lana had bought a new pair of shoes for work, which she was very excited about. The prosecution's argument was that a woman who was planning on killing herself the same day would not buy herself a new pair of shoes that she knew she was never going to be able to wear. On April 13th, 2009, Spector was found guilty of second-degree murder and of committing a crime using a firearm. When the verdict was read out, he didn't even react. On May 29th, he was sentenced to 19 years to life. Him and his lawyers have tried to appeal his sentence countless times, but they've never had any success, unsurprisingly. Spector is still serving his sentence today at the California State Prison, but he is eligible for parole in 2025. If he lives that long. His mugshot ended up going a bit viral actually, as nobody had seen Spector without a crazy wig on for many years, and obviously in prison you're not allowed to wear a wig or a hat or anything, since you could really be concealing anything under that. And so in his mugshot he is completely bald, and it's bloody terrifying. Personally, I agree with Spector being convicted. I think it's pretty obvious that he did it, although I don't think that he planned it or that he was really aware that he'd done it until he started sobering up. The fact that Lana was in the foyer and that she had her jacket on and her bag over her shoulder just proves to me that she was attempting to leave, especially since she'd already been there way longer than she said she was going to be. Considering what all the other women said on the stand in Spector's trial, I do think that it's probably likely that this exact same thing happened to Lana, that she tried to leave and that Spector had pulled a gun on her. And I think that he actually did fire the gun deliberately, but I don't think that at the time, because of how intoxicated he was, I don't think that he fully realised what the consequence of firing that gun would be. Also, the reason why I mentioned Spector's car accident earlier was that a lot of people have connected head injuries with serial killers. Some of the most well-known killers experienced head trauma as a child. John Wayne Gacy, David Berkowitz, Ed Gein, Richard Ramirez, etc, etc. So this could perhaps be used as an explanation for why Spector did this to Lana, although personally the fact that he was already exhibiting this behaviour before this car accident just kind of proves to me that they're probably not related, and they weren't allowed to use it in trial anyway. Anyway, he's trash, so I'm glad he's still in prison. There are actually people out there that do still defend him and think that he was innocent, which is like, just because somebody did some nice things in their life or improved things in some way doesn't mean that they are automatically a good person. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy it, then please do give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more like it. If you want to follow me on any of my social medias, they will be linked in the description below, along with all the sources that I used for this video if you fancy some extra reading, or watching in this case. If you have any theories or comments of your own about this case, then please do comment them down below. And if you have any other cases you'd like me to cover, then please comment them down below as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next week for another video that isn't probably going to be a movie mystery, but anyway, bye!